Zenobi Elliott clutched her trembling fingers together, staring at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. Her white wedding dress, borrowed from her cousin, hung too loose around her slender frame, a silent testament to the meals she'd been unable to force down since her father had arranged this marriage. Outside, she could hear the rustle of folks gathering for the ceremony at Lyndon's only church. It was 1873, and life in Kansas was hard for a woman alone. That was what her father kept reminding her. At 22, Zenobi was what folks around Lyndon called an old maid. When Victor Halloway, the wealthiest rancher in the county, had shown interest in her, her father had practically thrown her at him. Almost ready, child. Her mother's voice wavered as she entered the small back room of the church. "As ready as I'll ever be," Zenobi whispered, not meeting her mother's eyes. She couldn't bear to see the mixture of pity and relief there. Her mother adjusted the simple veil. "Victor is a good match. You'll want for nothing." Zenobi bit her lip to keep from crying. Yes, Victor was wealthy, but the whispers about town told another story. His first wife, Martha, had died just 8 months ago. The official story was fever, but Zenobi had seen Martha at the general store 2 weeks before her death. Her face yellowed with fading bruises she tried to hide beneath a thick layer of powder. "It's time," her father declared, appearing in the doorway. Thomas Elliott's stern face brooked no argument as he extended his arm. "The whole town is waiting." With leaden feet, Zenobi took her father's arm and allowed herself to be led toward the front of the church. The wooden pews were filled with the faces of neighbors and townsfolk, some smiling encouragingly, others whispering behind gloved hands. At the altar stood Victor Halloway, 45 years old, broad-shouldered and imposing in his black suit. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he watched her approach. Reverend Sims cleared his throat as Zenobi took her place beside Victor. She could smell whiskey on his breath, though it was barely noon. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, "we are gathered here today." The church doors slammed open with such force that the wooden walls seemed to shudder. Every head turned. Silhouetted against the bright Kansas sun stood a tall figure. As he stepped into the church, Zenobi recognized him, Wyatt Northcott, a cowboy who worked cattle drives between Kansas and Texas. He wasn't from Lyndon, but he passed through often enough that most knew him by name. His clothes were trail-worn, his face partially shadowed by his hat, but his eyes burned with a righteous intensity that made Zenobi catch her breath. "This wedding's over," Wyatt declared, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. Victor stepped forward, his face darkening with rage. "What's the meaning of this interruption, cowboy? Get out before I have you thrown out." Wyatt didn't flinch. He looked directly at Zenobi, then addressed the congregation. "This man," he pointed at Victor, "beat his last wife to death, and everyone in this town knows it." Gasps rippled through the church. Zenobi's father moved to stand between her and Wyatt. "These are serious accusations, Northcott. You'd better have proof before you slander a respectable man." "I've got all the proof that's needed." Wyatt stepped further into the church. "I was passing through last autumn when Martha Halloway came running from that big house on the hill, face bloodied, begging anyone to help her. I took her to Doc Wilson that night." All eyes shifted to the town doctor, who had suddenly found great interest in studying his hands. "Doc," Wyatt said, "tell them what you told me, about the broken ribs that never healed right, about the time she came to you with stories about falling downstairs in a house that ain't got none." Doc Wilson slowly rose to his feet, his elderly frame straightening with what seemed like relief. "It's true," he said quietly. "I treated Martha Halloway 17 times in 3 years for injuries consistent with violence." Victor lunged forward, "You old fool, you signed her death certificate as natural causes." "Because you threatened my granddaughter," Doc Wilson replied, his voice stronger now. "But I won't have another woman's death on my conscience." The church erupted in chaos. Victor reached for Zenobi, grabbing her arm with bruising force. "The ceremony will continue," he snarled. Wyatt moved with surprising speed. In 3 long strides he was at the altar, breaking Victor's grip on Zenobi's arm. "The lady's not marrying you, not today, not ever." "This is outrageous," Zenobi's father shouted. "The arrangements have been made, the contract signed." Wyatt turned to him with cold fury. "You'd sell your daughter to a murderer for a piece of grazing land." Victor's hand moved toward his jacket, but Sheriff Mills was quicker. The lawman had risen from his pew and now had his hand on his holstered gun. "That's enough, Victor. I think we need to have a long conversation about Martha's passing." The tension in the church was palpable as Victor looked from the sheriff to Wyatt to Zenobi, calculating his chances. "Miss Elliott," Wyatt said softly, extending his hand to Zenobi, "I believe you might want to reconsider your wedding day." Zenobi stared at his outstretched hand, aware that every eye in the church was on her. Her whole life she'd been taught to obey, to do what was expected. To be a dutiful daughter. But now, faced with a future of fear and pain, she found a courage she hadn't known she possessed. She placed her hand in Wyatt's. "I do," she whispered, then louder. "I do want to reconsider." A murmur ran through the congregation. Victor's face contorted with fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed before Sheriff Mills took his arm. "Let's go, Halloway. We've got matters to discuss." As they led Victor away, Zenobi felt a strange lightness. Wyatt still held her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why would you do this? You hardly know me." Wyatt's expression softened. "I couldn't stand by and watch history repeat itself, not when I had the chance to stop it. Where will I go now?" The reality of her situation began to sink in. She'd defied her father, humiliated her family. There would be no returning to their small homestead tonight. "My sister runs a boarding house in Topeka," Wyatt said. "It's a day's ride from here. She could use the help, and you'd have a safe place to stay until you decide what you want." Before Zenobi could answer, her mother approached, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I'm so sorry, Zenobi. I suspected about Martha, but your father." Zenobi embraced her mother. "It's all right, Mama." "It's not all right," her mother replied fiercely, "but it will be." She pressed something into Zenobi's hand, a small pouch that clinked with coins. "My egg money. I've been saving it. It's not much, but it will help you start somewhere new." Zenobi clutched the pouch, overwhelmed by her mother's gesture of defiance against a lifetime of submission. "Mrs. Elliott," Wyatt said respectfully, "I give you my word I'll see your daughter safely to Topeka." "I believe you will, Mr. Northcott." She touched his arm briefly. "Thank you for having the courage that others in this town lacked." Outside, the bright Kansas sun seemed to promise new possibilities. Wyatt helped Zenobi onto his horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding. "We should leave quickly," he said, glancing back at the church. "Victor has friends, and your father won't take this lightly." As they rode away from Linden, Zenobi felt both terror and exhilaration. She had no idea what the future held, only that she had escaped a fate worse than she had imagined. And beside her rode a man who had risked everything for a woman he barely knew. The journey to Topeka would take them through a day and night of hard riding. As the sun began to set, Wyatt guided them to a small grove of cottonwood trees near a creek. "We'll rest the horse and continue at first light," he said, helping Zenobi dismount. Her legs were stiff from hours in the saddle, and her wedding dress, a ridiculous garment for riding, was torn and dirty. Wyatt, noting her discomfort, reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "They'll be too big, but they'll be more comfortable for riding then. That." He gestured at her dress. Zenobi took the clothes gratefully. "Turn around," she instructed, and he obediently faced away while she changed behind a tree. The clothes hung on her frame, but with the sleeves rolled up and a piece of rope as a belt, they would serve. She stepped out from behind the tree, feeling strangely liberated in the masculine attire. Wyatt had built a small fire and was brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression made her self-conscious. "You look." He paused, searching for the right word. "Free." Zenobi smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. "I feel free, terrified but free." They sat by the fire as night fell, sharing the simple meal of jerky and hardtack that Wyatt carried in his saddlebags. The stars emerged overhead, brilliant against the vast Kansas sky. "Why were you in Linden today?" Zenobi asked finally. "It seems like more than coincidence." Wyatt poked at the fire with a stick before answering. "It wasn't coincidence. After what happened with Martha, I made a point to check on Linden whenever I was passing through. I heard about Victor's engagement to you in a saloon in Wichita last week." "So you rode all this way to stop a wedding for a woman you'd never even spoken to?" His eyes met hers across the fire. "I spoke with Martha before she died. She made me promise that if Victor ever tried to marry again, I would stop it, any way I could." Zenobi absorbed this, feeling a connection to the woman she had only known in passing. "Did she suffer at the end?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Yes, but she was brave. She gave me a letter detailing everything Victor had done to her over the years. I gave it to Sheriff Mills today before I came to the church. That's why he arrested Victor so readily." Wyatt nodded. "The law doesn't always protect women as it should, but Mills is a good man. With Martha's testimony and Doc Wilson's records, Victor Halloway won't be hurting anyone else." They fell silent, each lost in thought as the fire crackled between them. Zenobi found herself studying Wyatt in the flickering light, his strong profile, the way his hands moved with quiet assurance, the thoughtful set of his mouth. She realized with surprise that for the first time in her life, she felt truly safe in a man's presence. "What will you do after you take me to Topeka?" she asked. Wyatt shrugged. "I'm due in Abilene to help with a cattle drive. After that, I'm not sure. I've been thinking about settling somewhere, maybe starting my own small ranch." "No sweetheart waiting for you somewhere," a shadow passed over his face. "There was someone once. She couldn't abide the life of a cowboy's wife. Can't say I blame her." "I think it would be an adventure," Zenobi said softly, then blushed when he looked at her with surprise. "Most women don't see it that way." "I'm not most women. At least, I don't think I want to be any more." The night deepened around them. Wyatt insisted that Zenobi take his bedroll while he kept watch. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she tried to process the tumultuous events of the day. Just that morning, she had been preparing to marry a monster. Now she was fleeing across the Kansas prairie with a virtual stranger who had already shown her more kindness than most men she'd known all her life. As dawn broke, they continued their journey. Zenobi found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Linden, of her dreams of seeing more of the world than just Kansas, dreams she'd almost abandoned until yesterday. "My mother used to read to me from travel books," she told Wyatt as they rode side by side on a wider stretch of trail. "About places like San Francisco and New Orleans. I always thought someday I'd see them." "You still can," Wyatt said. "There's nothing stopping you now. Except for having no money, no skills, and nowhere to go beyond your sister's boarding house," she replied with a wry smile. "You've got more courage than you know," Wyatt said seriously. I saw it in the church, standing up to your father, to Victor, to the whole town that takes real grit." His words warmed her more than they should have. By midday, they had covered significant ground, but Wyatt was growing increasingly vigilant, frequently checking the trail behind them. "Are you expecting trouble?" Zenobi asked after he'd turned in the saddle for the third time in as many minutes. "Always best to expect it," he replied. Victor Halloway isn't a man to take humiliation lightly, and we're still in his territory. As if summoned by his words, the sound of hoofbeats reached them. Wyatt reined in sharply, scanning the horizon. In the distance, a cloud of dust signaled riders approaching fast from the direction of Linden. "Ride ahead," Wyatt instructed, his voice tense. "There's a ravine about half a mile up. You can hide there." "I'm not leaving you," Zenobi protested. "This isn't a discussion." His eyes were hard. "I promised to get you to safety, and that's what I intend to do." Before she could argue further, the riders crested the hill behind them. There were 4 of them, and even at a distance, Zenobi recognized her father's sturdy form and Victor's broad shoulders. "Too late," Wyatt muttered. He quickly guided their horse off the trail and into a stand of trees. "Stay behind me." They dismounted, and Wyatt drew his revolver, checking it with practiced efficiency. Zenobi's heart hammered in her chest as the riders approached. She searched the ground and found a heavy branch, gripping it like a club. Victor's party slowed as they reached the trees, spreading out to surround them. Victor himself rode forward, his face a mask of cold fury. "There's the thieving cowboy," he called out, "and my runaway bride." His eyes fixed on Zenobi with such malevolence that she involuntarily stepped closer to Wyatt. "She's not your bride, Halloway," Wyatt responded evenly, "and she's under my protection now." Thomas Elliott spurred his horse forward. "Zenobi, you're coming home right now. You've disgraced our family enough." "I'm not going anywhere with him," Zenobi called back, nodding toward Victor. "And if you were any kind of father, you wouldn't ask me to." Victor's laugh was ugly. "Listen to her, grown a backbone overnight. We'll soon break that spirit, won't we, Thomas?" "You won't touch her," Wyatt said, his voice deadly quiet. "Sheriff Mills has Martha's letter. Your days of hurting women are over, Halloway." Victor's face contorted. "Mills has no authority out here, and dead men don't testify." He drew his gun with surprising speed. The shot cracked through the quiet prairie air, but it was Wyatt who fired first. Victor clutched his shoulder, his own shot going wide as he nearly fell from his horse. "Next one won't be a warning," Wyatt said coldly. "Take him back to Linden, Mr. Elliott. Your daughter's made her choice." The other riders, Victor's ranch hands who had little personal stake in the matter, looked uncertain. Victor, bleeding but still dangerous, glared at Wyatt with naked hatred. "This isn't over, cowboy," he snarled. "Yes, it is," came a new voice. From behind a rise rode Sheriff Mills with 2 deputies. "I thought you might try something like this, Halloway. That's why I followed you out here." Relief flooded through Zenobi as the sheriff and his men took control of the situation. Victor was disarmed and bound to his horse despite his protests. Her father, looking suddenly old and defeated, could barely meet her eyes. "Zenobi," he began, but she cut him off. "You were willing to sacrifice me to a man you knew was dangerous," she said, fighting back tears. "I don't know if I can forgive that." Thomas Elliott's shoulders slumped. "Your mother. She told me everything after you left, about the whispers in town about Martha. I didn't want to believe it." He glanced at Victor with disgust. "I came to bring you home, not to him." Zenobi wanted to believe him, but the memory of his blind ambition was too fresh. "I need time, Father. I'm going to Topeka. Perhaps someday I'll come home to visit Mother." Sheriff Mills approached them, his weathered face serious. "Miss Elliott, I'll need your statement about what happened here today and about the wedding. Would you be willing to come back to Linden?" Zenobi looked at Wyatt, who gave a slight nod. "We'll come back," she told the sheriff, "but I'm still leaving afterward." As the sheriff's party led Victor away, with her father following reluctantly, Zenobi felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, lingering fear, and an unexpected sense of possibility. "You handled yourself well," Wyatt said quietly as they mounted up to follow the others back to Linden. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what's right despite the fear." His eyes held hers for a moment. "You're quite a woman, Zenobi Elliott." The return to Linden was surreal. Word of the confrontation had somehow preceded them, and townspeople lined the main street as they rode in. Some looked judgmental, but many, especially the women, nodded approvingly as Zenobi passed. At the sheriff's office, they gave their statements. Martha's letter was read aloud, a devastating account of years of escalating abuse that left Zenobi shaken and grateful for her narrow escape. Victor would be held for trial, and with the evidence mounting against him, conviction seemed certain. As they prepared to leave Linden again, this time with the sheriff's blessing, Zenobi's mother came to say goodbye. She carried a small carpet bag. "Your things," she explained, pressing it into Zenobi's hands, "and letters when you're ready to read them. I've been writing to you for years, things I wanted to say but never had the courage to speak aloud." Zenobi embraced her mother tightly. "I'll write to you from Topeka," she promised. With one last look at the town that had been her whole world, Zenobi rode away beside Wyatt, toward an uncertain future that nevertheless felt full of promise. The journey to Topeka resumed, but something had changed between them. The shared danger had forged a bond. They talked more freely now, sharing stories of their lives, their hopes, their disappointments. Wyatt told her about growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing his parents to fever and setting out at 17 to make his way in the world. He spoke of the freedom he'd found on the open range, the camaraderie of cattle drives, the simple pleasures of a life unbound by convention. Zenobi, in turn, confessed her secret rebellions, books hidden under her mattress, dreams she'd never dared speak aloud, her quiet resistance to the narrow future that had been planned for her. They camped once more under the stars before reaching Topeka, and this time when Wyatt offered her his bedroll, she suggested they share the fire's warmth side by side. Nothing improper occurred, but the simple comfort of another's presence, the whispered conversations as they gazed at the infinite sky, created an intimacy neither had expected. Topeka, when they arrived, was a revelation to Zenobi. Though not a large city by Eastern standards, it dwarfed Linden with its brick buildings, busy streets, and diverse population. Wyatt led her to a well-maintained two-story house on a quiet street, with a sign that read, "Northcott Boarding House." The door was opened by a woman with Wyatt's same steady eyes, though her hair was a shade lighter than his chestnut brown. Viola Northcott embraced her brother warmly, then turned a kind but assessing gaze on Zenobi. "So this is the young lady you rescued," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. "Come in, both of you. You look exhausted." Over a proper meal, the first Zenobi had enjoyed in days, Wyatt explained their situation. Viola listened attentively, asking occasional pointed questions that revealed her sharp intelligence. "Of course you can stay," she told Zenobi when Wyatt had finished. "I can always use an extra pair of hands, and it sounds like you've earned a safe harbor." "I don't want to be a burden," Zenobi began, but Viola waved away her concern. "Burden? Hardly. This place keeps me run off my feet. If you can cook, clean, or manage accounts, you'll be earning your keep and then some." "I can do all three," Zenobi replied with growing confidence. Viola smiled approvingly. "Then we'll get along just fine." That evening, after being shown to a small but comfortable room under the eaves, Zenobi found Wyatt preparing to leave. He was checking his saddle in the small stable behind the boarding house. "You're going already?" she asked, unable to keep the disappointment from her voice. He straightened, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "I'm due in Abilene. The cattle drive won't wait, of course." She twisted her hands together. "I never properly thanked you for everything you've done." "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly, "they wouldn't. The entire town of Linden was willing to watch me marry a monster. You were the only one who stood up." He looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You'll be safe here. Viola's a good woman, though she'll work you hard. Will you come back after your cattle drive?" The question slipped out before she could reconsider it. Wyatt's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, unspoken but powerful. "If I'm welcome." "You are." She stepped closer, emboldened by the knowledge that this might be their last moment together for months. "More than welcome." In the quiet of the stable, with only a restless horse and the distant sounds of the town for company, Wyatt hesitated, then gently cupped her face in his calloused hands. The kiss was tender, questioning, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Zenobi felt a certainty she had never known. "I'll be waiting," she whispered. "Then I'll have a reason to come back," he replied. In the months that followed, Zenobi found herself flourishing in ways she never could have in Linden. Viola proved to be not just an employer but a mentor and friend, teaching Zenobi the business of running the boarding house while encouraging her independence. News reached them that Victor Halloway had been convicted of Martha's murder and sentenced to hang. Zenobi felt no joy at this, only relief that justice had been served, and that no other woman would suffer at his hands. She wrote to her mother weekly, and eventually received cautious letters from her father as well, suggesting a slow path toward reconciliation. The wider world of Topeka offered opportunities she had only dreamed of: lectures at the newly established library, musical performances, conversations with travelers from across the country who stayed at the boarding house. But always, her thoughts returned to Wyatt. True to his word, he wrote when he could short, unadorned letters that nevertheless revealed the depth of his feelings. He told her of the cattle drive, of the big sky over Texas, of the plans he was making for the future. A future she dared to hope that might include her. When autumn painted the trees around Topeka in fiery hues, a familiar figure appeared at the boarding house door. Wyatt stood there, trail-worn but smiling, his eyes finding Zenobi instantly among the breakfast guests she was serving. Later, walking along the river that ran through town, he told her of his decision. "I've bought land about 20 miles from here. It's not much, 100 acres with a small cabin, but it's a start." "A start for what?" she asked, her heart quickening. "For a ranch of my own. A home." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "Zenobi, I know we haven't known each other long, not really, and I'm not much compared to what you could have here in town, but these months apart have only convinced me of what I started to feel on the trail from Linden. I love you." The words, simple and direct like the man himself, filled her with joy. "And I love you, Wyatt Northcott. I think I have since you walked into that church and saved me. I'm not asking you to decide right away," he continued. "The cabin needs work before it's fit for a lady. I'd understand if you wanted to stay in Topeka with all it has to offer." Zenobi shook her head, smiling at his uncertainty. "I've spent my life being told where I belong and what I should want. For the first time, I get to choose, and I choose you and whatever adventure comes with loving you." The kiss they shared by the river sealed a promise that had begun months ago in a moment of courage and conscience. They were married that December, in Viola's parlor rather than a church, with Zenobi's mother making the journey to Topeka for the occasion. The bride wore blue, not white, and there were no whispers, no doubts, only the certainty of two people who had found in each other not just love but true partnership. The small ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Wyatt's knowledge of cattle and horses complemented Zenobi's skill with accounts and household management. They worked side by side, through harsh winters and bountiful springs, building something neither had dared to dream possible. 3 years after their wedding, Zenobi gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after Wyatt's father. As she watched her husband holding their newborn with gentle wonder, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a reluctant bride on the verge of a life of misery to a woman fully in possession of her own destiny. "What are you thinking?" Wyatt asked, noticing her thoughtful expression as he laid the sleeping infant in his cradle. "About choices," she replied. "About how one moment of courage can change everything." He sat beside her on their bed, taking her hand in his. "When I rode into Linden that day, I had no idea what would come of it. I just knew I couldn't stand by and watch another woman suffer as Martha had." "You saved more than my life that day," Zenobi said softly. "You saved my future, my hope." She squeezed his hand. "Our future." Outside their window, the Kansas prairie stretched to the horizon, vast and full of possibility, much like the life they were building together, a life founded on respect, partnership, and a love that had begun in the most unexpected circumstances. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter, Clara, joined them 2 years after James, followed by another son, Daniel. The ranch expanded as Wyatt's careful stewardship and Zenobi's shrewd business sense turned their modest beginning into a prosperous enterprise. Zenobi's relationship with her father had slowly mended. Thomas Elliott, humbled by the recognition of how close he had come to condemning his daughter to a monster's control, became a doting grandfather who visited often, bringing handcrafted toys and boundless patience for his grandchildren's antics. The scandal of Linden had faded into history, but its lessons remained. Wyatt and Zenobi made their home a haven not only for their children but occasionally for other women escaping difficult situations. More than once, a desperate young woman would arrive at their door, having heard through whispered networks of a safe place where help could be found. On the 10th anniversary of the day Wyatt had stopped her wedding, they sat on the porch of their substantially expanded home, watching their children playing in the yard as the sun set over their land. "You ever regret it?" Wyatt asked unexpectedly. "Not the escape from Halloway, but choosing this life. You could have had a different path in Topeka, maybe even gone east eventually." Zenobi looked at him with surprise. "Regret this?" She gestured to encompass their home, their children, the life they had built. "Never. This is more than I ever dared to dream." "You've worked so hard," he said, taking her hand. "Sometimes I think about how soft your hands were that first day and how callous they are now." She laughed. "These calluses are badges of honor, not hardship. Every one represents something I've built or grown or created." She leaned against his shoulder. "Besides, your hands weren't exactly smooth when we met, Cowboy." He chuckled, wrapping an arm around her. "No, I suppose they weren't. We match," she said simply, "in all the ways that matter." As twilight deepened into night, they called the children in for supper. Their home was filled with the chaos and joy of family life, arguments over who would say grace, stories of the day's adventures, plans for tomorrow's work and play. Later, when the children were asleep and they had the quiet of night to themselves, Wyatt held Zenobi close. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "James is old enough to take more responsibility with the cattle. Maybe it's time we took that trip you've always talked about." Zenobi raised herself on one elbow to look at him. San Francisco, he nodded. The railroad makes it possible now. We could go in the spring after calving season, see the ocean like you've wanted. The thoughtfulness of his suggestion brought tears to her eyes. You remembered. I remember everything you've ever told me about your dreams, he said seriously. And I intend to help you fulfill every one I can. In the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Zenobi reflected on the extraordinary journey of her life. From a young woman resigned to a loveless marriage to a partner in a thriving ranch and a loving family. From believing her only value lay in being a dutiful daughter and wife to knowing herself capable of both tenderness and strength. And at the center of it all was this remarkable man who had ridden into a church in Linden, Kansas, 10 years ago, and declared with unshakable certainty that she deserved better. I love you, Wyatt Northcott, she whispered. And I love you, Zenobi Northcott, he replied, more with each passing day. As she drifted into sleep in the circle of his arms, Zenobi knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the greatest act of courage was to accept love when it was offered, and to build a life on its foundation of trust and respect. That was the lesson she hoped to pass on to her daughters and sons, that true love wasn't about possession or control, but about standing beside one another through whatever life might bring. The following spring, true to his word, Wyatt arranged for Viola to come stay with the children while he and Zenobi made the journey to California. Standing on the shores of the Pacific, watching the sun set into waters that seemed to stretch forever, Zenobi felt a sense of completion. It's even more beautiful than I imagined, she said, her hand firmly in Wyatt's. Worth waiting for? He asked. She turned to him, seeing in his weathered face the same steadfast heart that had captured hers a decade ago. Yes, she said with certainty, just like you were. The ocean breeze carried away her words, but not before Wyatt heard them. He pulled her close, and together they watched darkness fall over the edge of the continent, secure in the knowledge that whatever adventures still awaited them, they would face them as they had faced everything since that fateful day in Linden together, with courage and with love. Years continued to pass, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Their children grew, the ranch prospered, and Wyatt and Zenobi's partnership deepened with each challenge they overcame together. When hard times came, droughts, harsh winters, economic downturns, they faced them with the same resilience that had characterized their union from the beginning. James, their eldest, grew into a thoughtful young man who combined his father's quiet strength with his mother's quick intelligence. He showed a natural affinity for ranching, but also a curiosity about the wider world that Zenobi recognized from her own youth. Clara, fiercely independent from her earliest days, announced at 16 that she intended to become a doctor, inspired by the care they had provided to women in need over the years. Rather than discouraging such an ambitious goal for a daughter, Wyatt and Zenobi began setting aside funds for her education. Daniel, their youngest, had Wyatt's gift with horses and a gentle way about him that made even the most skittish creatures trust him implicitly. By the time he was 12, neighboring ranchers were bringing their difficult mounts to him for training. As the 19th century drew to a close and a new era dawned, Wyatt and Zenobi found themselves elders in a community that had grown around their ranch. Linden was now a distant memory, though they occasionally received news from there through Zenobi's mother, until her passing in 1895. On the 25th anniversary of their wedding, their children organized a celebration that brought together friends, neighbors, and family from across the region. Under a canopy of stars, with lanterns illuminating the faces of those who had shared in their journey, Wyatt raised a glass to his wife. "25 years ago," he said, his voice carrying in the hushed night, "I made the best decision of my life when I asked this extraordinary woman to share my path. I was just a cowboy with more dreams than sense, but somehow she saw something worth believing in." Zenobi, her dark hair now threaded with silver but her eyes as bright as ever, squeezed his hand. "And I saw a man of honor," she replied, loud enough for all to hear, "who taught me that love shouldn't hurt, that partnership is stronger than possession, and that the greatest adventures come from following your heart even when the path isn't clear." Around them, their children and grandchildren, for James had married young and already had 2 children of his own, raised their glasses in tribute to a union that had begun in drama, but had flourished in steady, everyday acts of love and respect. Later, when the celebration had wound down and they were alone on the porch of the home they had built together, Zenobi rested her head on Wyatt's shoulder, content in the quiet companionship they had cultivated over a quarter-century. "You ever think about that day?" she asked. "In the church?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "Though not as often as I used to. It feels like another lifetime now." "It was," she said thoughtfully, "for both of us. You know, I've never properly thanked Martha." Wyatt looked at her questioningly. "Her courage in writing that letter, in making you promise to watch over Lyndon. Without that, we might never have met, at least not in the way we did." Wyatt nodded soberly. "I've thought the same, that something good could come from such tragedy." "It doesn't erase what happened to her," Zenobi said. "Nothing could. But I like to think she'd be pleased to know that her final act helped not just me, but all the women we've assisted over the years." In the soft Kansas night, surrounded by the sounds of the land they had tended together, they sat in comfortable silence. 2 people who had grown together through seasons of hardship and joy, bound by a love that had begun in a moment of courage and had deepened through countless choices to stand by one another, day after ordinary day. And in that ordinary moment, as in so many before it, they found the extraordinary blessing of a love that had not just endured but had flourished, creating ripples that extended far beyond themselves to their children, to the women they had helped, to the community they had helped to build. It had all begun with a simple declaration in a small church in Lyndon, Kansas. "This wedding's over." What had followed was a lifetime of saying yes to each other, to the family they created, to the values they shared, and to the love that had surprised them both with its depth and resilience. As the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Kansas sky, Wyatt and Zenobi Northcott held hands, grateful for the journey that had brought them here and for all the days still to come, ordinary days made extraordinary by the simple, profound blessing of loving and being loved in return.